In 1996, after the buffoon Yeltsin won his re-election and Bill Clinton in the United States also won his re-election, NATO confirmed that it was going to violate the commitments made to Russia, informal, non-legally binding, but commitments nonetheless that were made to Russia that it wouldn't expand. And it invited a bunch of Eastern European countries to join. And I think it was the first expansion was formalized in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic being allowed to join NATO. So basically, this was really the West formalizing its control over Central Europe. Hungary here, the Czech Republic here, Poland here. So Central Europe became fully part of NATO. And as I mentioned last time, when you become part of NATO, it's not just that you are in an alliance with the United States. What actually happens is that all of your equipment is changed to become interoperable with NATO equipment, and your army becomes a cog in the American-led NATO machine. So this isn't sort of, France and Russia signing a treaty to say that they will stop German aggression in the 19th century. No, this is a lot more involved in that it places these militaries under a single command, and obviously this is American command. That's what it does. So the first step was really expanding towards Central Europe, which is still a little bit of distance from Russia's own borders. There's still the Baltic states, there's Belarus, there's Ukraine, there's Romania and Bulgaria, but promises are made to other countries that they can eventually join NATO in the teeth of pretty obvious and strong Russian opposition. So you have this picture of large-scale internal collapse in Russia, and you have the subsequent taking advantage of that picture, which is the expansion of NATO into areas that had been well within Russia's sphere of influence. Remember, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, East Germany, these were all within the Warsaw Pact. And there was a string of neutral buffer states, Finland, Sweden, Austria, to some extent Yugoslavia here in the Baltics, that were not aligned with either side, and that therefore played a role of keeping the peace and keeping the militaries of the two sides apart from each other, except in Germany, where they were, Germany was the main frontline state, really, between NATO and the Russian-led Warsaw Pact. So that's the context in which Putin takes power, and he's elevated to some planning position in the late 1990s, and then he becomes prime minister in 1999, as Boris Yeltsin, the drunken buffoon, prepares to leave office, having served 2 terms, which were completely disastrous for Russian society. Absolutely disastrous on life expectancy, law and order, employment, inflation, international credibility, economy, pretty much every metric. The 1990s were a complete disaster for Russia. And Putin inherits this semi-collapsed state. And one of the most egregious things for you if you're Russian is that just a decade ago, you were the only other superpower in the world, leading a massive alliance, and now you're in a state in near collapse. And so the first thing that Putin does is that he solves the terrorism problem. And the way that he solves the terrorism problem is that he goes against the Chechen insurgency and absolutely destroys the city of Grozny. He just goes after the Chechens without any mercy, and he ends that insurgency once and for all, and he installs a loyalist, first Ahmed Kadyrov, and then his son Ramzan Kadyrov, who's still ruling until today, as the only authority who's in charge of Chechnya. It's a trusted ally. The Chechens get what they need to rebuild. Afterwards, there's a lot of Russian investment into Chechnya after it gets destroyed, but he wins that war decisively. The second thing that Putin does is that he takes control over the oligarchs. It's widely acknowledged that it's the economic liberalization of Russia that created the oligarchs, and that this was done at the behest of the IMF. Obviously not the corruption of it, but there were voices in Russia saying, let's privatize slowly, let's not sort of jump into this. The result of this wave of privatizations that Yeltsin oversaw in the 1990s was that a big group of oligarchs became billionaires. I asked Grok to help me research and identify them. And of 40 top oligarchs, Grok says that 18 were of a particular ethnic group. And of 7 top banks in Russia, 6 were controlled by the same group. So it was wholesale looting of Russia. Putin sits these oligarchs down and lays down the law and explains to them that unless you obey me completely and use your resources in the way that I say you will, I'm going to take away everything from you. Now remember, in 1996, during the re-election campaign of Boris Yeltsin, it was the oligarchs who supported him fully, along with American consultants and advisors, and they helped him win the election against the communists who were making a resurgence. The West didn't want the communists back in charge of Russia, especially now that they could reform the system. So they supported Yeltsin. And Yeltsin chose Putin in part because Putin was unknown, and in part because Putin promised that he wouldn't pursue Yeltsin or his family, especially his daughter, for their own ostentatious corruption. So Putin made that commitment that he wouldn't go after the oligarchs directly, or that he wouldn't go after Yeltsin and hold him to account for his corruption that enabled the oligarchs. And that made the oligarchs feel safe. And so in 2000, when Yeltsin had resigned and it was time for Putin to run for president, the oligarchs fully supported him and they backed him. But a few months after they did that, and after he won the election, he turned the tables on them. And he made it clear to them that this era where it was the oligarchs who were governing Russia is over. And he would fully use the apparatus of the state in order to make the oligarchs fall in line and serve the Russian national interest. And in exchange for that, he wouldn't go after them for all of the corruption that they were involved in and for all of the crime that they were involved in the 1990s. And so Putin manages to restore law and order in Russia, and he manages to bring the Russian state back to capability and back to functioning and to halt the decline. And you see various metrics like life expectancy, alcoholism, health in general, employment, income. You see these beginning turn around as Putin consolidates power, and he benefits to some extent from a spike in energy prices in the early 2000s that helps him fulfill this agenda. It obviously makes the oligarchs, especially the ones who were in oil and gas, even richer. But it also means that that the Russian state begins to recover and is able to rebuild. So a lot of the weapons programs that had been worked on by the Soviets in the 1980s, but that were scrapped or suspended in the 1990s because there was no money, these weapons programs are put back online. And you see a return of Russian military capability, although not at a level that allows it to challenge NATO. The next big event that we should talk about is obviously September 11. So September 11 happens, and Putin is one of the first people to call George W. Bush, the American president at the time, and to offer his condolences and to offer his support. And you have to remember, the Russians had been fighting since 1994 against a jihadi insurgency in their own country, and they had spent the 1980s fighting in Afghanistan against the Mujahideen who had been sponsored and backed by the United States. And they are quite concerned that with their own defeat in Afghanistan, this would pave the way for the radicalization of Central Asia, and this would mean that Russia is at even greater risk of a jihadi insurgency, given its quite large and substantial Muslim population. So Putin tries to cast this as a shared fight with shared values, trying to use the language of George W. Bush. Look, I won the elections fair and square. It was a democratic election. It was similar to American elections in the campaigning and in the use of money and in the use of media and in all of that stuff. We're on the same side. You've expanded NATO now. Can you please stop? It's enough. You've taken over Central Europe. We need to build a better relationship now, and we need to find a way so that we can cooperate in this fight against terrorism. And the Russians go to great lengths. They help as much as they can with Afghanistan, including by helping the Americans and NATO in general traverse Russian territory to get resupplied into Afghanistan. You have to remember, Afghanistan is a landlocked country with, the only friendly state next to it to the Americans is Pakistan. And the Americans had to make an insane number of threats to the Pakistanis to allow them to deploy forces to Afghanistan via Pakistan. And then the rest of the neighbors are Iran, with which the United States will go on to declare as as part of the axis of evil in the George W. Bush speech of 2002. And the others around it are the Central Asian republics, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. These are all former parts of the Soviet Union. They were part of Greater Russia, and they were only independent in the 1990s, after 1990, 1991, and the people ruling them are deeply tied to the KGB. And so the Russians do whatever they can to facilitate NATO's mission in Afghanistan in the hope that this would be seen as Russia and the United States fighting together against a shared enemy, which is radical Islamic jihadism.
If you enjoyed this piece of premium content from the Lotus Eaters, head to our website where you can find more.